A very good afternoon to you and a very warm welcome. You're attending the inaugural Standard Chartered and British Chamber of Commerce webinar aimed at promoting sustainability development in Vietnam and the application of ESG amongst businesses to aid you in your ESG considerations as you plan your own sustainable development initiatives. At Standard Chartered, we have made our own commitments towards United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to achieve net zero by 2030 as an organization and for our balance sheet by 2050. We have heard from our investors and our clients to accelerate our efforts without slowing development. This means that we will need to educate, to support, and mobilize finance to facilitate decarbonizing our clients and their supply chains. We are fully committed to this global agenda. The governments of Vietnam and the UK have both recognized the strategic importance of sustainability in their development agenda, so have Bridgeham member businesses. The webinar series is a further step in our efforts to promote sustainable development in Vietnam by sharing the latest insights on global practices and local environment as it relates to sustainability and ESG. We will be running a series of these webinars till the end of 2022 on topical matters. We are taking feedback through our organization on what you feel you need to know more of, and we will involve key and relevant stakeholders from the government, the regulators, and industry thought leaders. Today being the first is no exception, and we hope you do find our topic on achieving net zero, carbon markets, and their role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, perspectives from Vietnam and the Asia region, thought-provoking. We have a great lineup for you today, and this will start with a keynote speech by Ambassador Gareth Ward, UK Ambassador to Vietnam. Ambassador Ward will share his insights on upcoming COP26 initiatives and the role of businesses to escalate a low-carbon environment to support climate change and sustainability. This is followed by a keynote speech by Mr. Tang Thi Keung, Director of the Department of Climate Change, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, who will share the direction and the strategy of Vietnam towards climate change, the collective effort of the Vietnamese government and institutions in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including the development plans of Vietnam's very own carbon exchange. We'll then hear from thought leaders, Mr. Chris Lee, Executive Director, Carbon Markets Development of Standard Chartered Bank London, Unilever Vietnam Chairman, Ms. Nguyen Thi Bích Vâng, and Ms. Karen Wesley, VP of Carbon and Environment at Shell Global Solutions. You can post your questions on the chat anytime during the presentations, and our moderator, Denzel, will facilitate your questions with our panel. Without further ado, let me welcome Ambassador Gareth Ward with our first keynote speech. Ambassador Ward, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Can I just check in that everyone can hear me? Give me the thumbs up. Great. Okay, well, I'll get going then. So we've got 1 month left until COP26. That's the Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the big intergovernmental meeting that happens to drive ambition in the fight against climate change. And we're expecting around about 130 heads of state and governments to attend in Glasgow, which will be the biggest international conference for a number of years and shows that there is a head of momentum building up behind this issue. And in a phrase, we have to make breakthroughs at Glasgow to keep 1.5 alive, which means keeping global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And we've already gone up 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial times. So the space is running out. And that requires at country level and at business level for us to make net zero commitments aiming for 2050. So far, we have registered 137 countries who have made a net zero commitment, nearly all of them by 2050. If we could do a quiz, I'd ask you which are the 2 countries in the world which are already net zero or even net carbon negative. I'm not sure you would guess. They are Bhutan and Suriname. So 2 small countries. We've got to get the big countries and the big emitters going in the right direction. Of course, governments can set commitments. They can put them into law. Sweden has a legal net zero commitment for 2045. The UK has a legal commitment for 78% reductions by 2030. So governments can put things into law and can give regulatory signals and incentives for businesses and people to change their behaviours, but that's not going to be enough. We need to start this momentum shifting through the whole global economy, and that's why the race to zero under COP26 is about drawing in a range of sectors. We've identified 23 key sectors of the economy globally. I won't go through all of them. I'll send a link to the report which takes you through those sectors. I'll just highlight a few of those 23. The first one is really at the top of the list because clean power is the single most important shift we have to make. In Vietnam, for instance, energy is 70% of the emissions, and 50% of that is the power sector. And the objective there has to be to move globally to 60% renewables for energy by 2030, and to be fully decarbonised in our energy systems by the 2040s. And that's a big challenge. I'll come back to that relating to Vietnam later. Another sector that is a very high carbon emitter, particularly in Asia and this part of the world fast developing, is cement and concrete. And we have to get businesses, concrete producers, to move to carbon neutral cement and concrete production. We've got a target of having a quarter of all cement and concrete carbon neutral by 2030, and then the full target by 2050. Another sector appropriate to talk about in Vietnam, especially for those of you down in Ho Chi Minh City, is cooling and air conditioning. The target that we're setting for business to sign up to is to get 20% of air conditioning units working at 5 times more efficiency than the baseline of 2020 within 5 years. There's a huge amount that can be done by replacing old inefficient aircon units with new efficient ones. Then there's another sector which, alongside clean power, is arguably the most important of all, and that's the financial sector. And Michelle already spoke to that in terms of Standard Chartered's commitments for their own net zero by 2030 and their portfolio by 2050. So we need banks, we need asset managers, we need asset owners, and we need insurers to all improve their systems so they can track the carbon emissions of their business and bear down on them. I think we'll be hearing more about that later on in this seminar. Another sector which you don't automatically think about when you think about carbon emissions is ICT. We need 80% of the industrial energy used for ICT products to come from renewables by 2030. And finally, a sector which, of course, has driven industrialization in the 20th century, but cannot be at the center of industrialization of the 21st century, oil and gas. We need a 40% reduction in production globally by 2030. So those are some of the targets. I'll send around a fuller report. You can look into all of the sectors, ones which particularly interest you. But that so far I think has been perhaps a little bit of a warning and a sense of the scale of the challenge. But the good news is that businesses are stepping up. We see through initiatives like the Renewable Energy 100, RE100, that's companies who are committing to have 100% of their energy renewable. Through the EV 100, that's companies who are committing that 100% of their vehicles will be electric. We see it through the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a mechanism to make sure that financial institutions are able to track and be clear and open about how they are greening their portfolios. So I've got a couple of minutes left of my 10. Let me just switch a bit more, zero in on Vietnam, because we are conscious that Vietnam is both a victim of climate change, and I'm sure, like many of you, I've seen the damage of extreme weather events, flooding, and so on in central Vietnam. I've seen the damage caused by rising sea levels in the Mekong Delta and salination and potential wiping out of up to 20 million livelihoods in agriculture. So I know that Vietnam needs international finance to help on the adaptation side and on the emissions side, because Vietnam is not just a victim of climate change. Vietnam's massive economic growth means it's now becoming one of the top 20 future emitters, particularly of coal-related emissions. So this is an area where we really need to come together as international governments and international business to provide a persuasive offer to Vietnam to move away from coal. At the moment, Vietnam still plans to double the amount of coal power that it uses before 2030, but we need to show that there's a different way, and that if international overseas development assistance helps the Vietnamese government to invest in the grid, then international business will come in and invest in the clean power production. And a final point as I conclude is to think about energy intensiveness and the attractiveness of Vietnam for FDI. I know of a European company that has explicitly said to the Vietnamese government, we want to invest in production in Vietnam $1 billion, but we have to have 100% renewable energy. And at the moment, it's difficult for the Vietnamese government to promise that. Therefore, we know that many businesses will want their supply chains to be green, many multinational businesses, and we know that at the moment, Vietnam uses twice as much energy per output of GDP compared to China, just over the border. So Vietnam can improve in those areas with investment from international business. Thanks very much. I hope I've covered some ground of interest to most of you. This is a priority for the UK as the chair of COP, happening in a month, but doesn't stop there. We remain as the chair of COP for a year, and in any case, sustainability and climate change are key themes of the UK's engagement with Vietnam, and we're very happy to partner with Standard Chartered and with BritCham on this theme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ward. We hear you. Thank you for your insights. We 100% agree. We're all very keen to hear the conclusions from COP26 to progress and accelerate zero as well. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Tang Thi Kong, Director of Climate Change of Monterey, for his keynote address. Mr. Kong.
Trước tiên thưa ông Gareth Wood, Đại sứ Vương quốc Anh tại Việt Nam, thưa bà Michelle Wee, Tổng Giám đốc Ngân hàng Standard Chartered Bank Việt Nam, và ông Dan Zet, thành viên Hội đồng Quản trị Hiệp hội Doanh nghiệp Anh Quốc tại Việt Nam, và kính thưa các quý vị đại biểu tại các cái đầu cầu trực tuyến. Hôm nay tôi cũng rất là vui Đấy, và tham dự một cái cuộc họp, cái hội thảo mà chúng ta đã bàn đến một cái chủ đề rất là quan trọng đối với tất cả các cái công dân trên thế giới. Thay mặt Cục Biến đổi Khí hậu của Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường, tôi rất là hoan nghênh ngân hàng Standard Chartered Bank và BritCham đã tổ chức về cái hội thảo này. Đấy, trong đó chúng ta đặt focus vào các vấn đề về giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính, ứng phó với biến đổi khí hậu. Thì đầu tiên tôi cũng nhiệt liệt chào mừng các vị đại biểu, các doanh nghiệp tham dự hội thảo trực tuyến này. Các vị đã biết là vấn đề biến đổi khí hậu thì như các vị ngài đại sứ Anh cũng đã đề cập rồi. Tôi cũng xin nêu rằng là nó đang là vấn đề rất là nghiêm trọng đối với cuộc sống và cái sự phát triển bền vững của toàn nhân loại trên thế giới. Và cái nhiều nền văn hóa rồi các hệ sinh thái thì cũng đang bị mất đi do cái tác động của biến đổi khí hậu, và nó đã tác động mạnh mẽ đến cả các quốc gia, kể cả tác động đến về mặt chính trị, ngoại giao, thương mại, và nảy sinh các cái vấn đề về an ninh phi truyền thống. Thế thì theo báo cáo hiện trạng khí hậu do Hiệp hội Khí tượng Hoa Kỳ công bố thì kể từ năm 1980 thì cứ mỗi thập kỷ sau thì lại nóng hơn thập kỷ trước. Thế mà do đó mà cái thập kỷ 2010 cho đến 2020 đã nóng hơn cái thập kỷ 2000 đến 2010 khoảng 0,2 độ C. Đây cũng là một cái nguyên nhân mà do biến đổi khí hậu cũng không ngừng gia tăng. Thế thì nó đã đạt đến cái mức cao kỷ lục là cái chuyện mà chúng ta nước phát thải khí nhà kính đã không ngừng gia tăng và đạt mức cao kỷ lục là 409,8 phần triệu thể tích của chúng ta trên toàn cầu. Trong thời gian tới thì biến đổi khí hậu chúng ta cũng nhận thức được rằng nó vẫn còn tiếp tục diễn biến rất là khó lường và tác động nó càng nghiêm trọng. Đấy, thế thì theo cái báo cáo cuối năm 2020 của Viện Toàn cầu McKinsey, thế thì người ta cho rằng là cái tác động của biến đổi khí hậu thì đến các nước Đông Nam Á sẽ tổn thất từ 8 đến 13% GDP mỗi năm cho đến 2050. Đấy, chúng ta phải thấy rằng là các cái vấn đề biến đổi khí hậu chỉ diễn ra nó nghiêm trọng đến như vậy. Thế thì ở trên thế giới thì các nhà tiên phong khí hậu của Liên Hợp Quốc hiện nay thì cũng đã kêu gọi các cái quốc gia, các thành phố, các doanh nghiệp, các ngành kinh tế và các cái nhà đầu tư phải cùng nhau chung tay ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu và công bố các cái kế hoạch thực hiện để mà nhằm đến cái mục tiêu phát thải bằng không vào 2050. Đấy, chúng ta phải thấy rằng là cái vấn đề nó rất là quan trọng. Thế thì còn hiện nay ấy, thì vấn đề phát thải bằng không chúng ta có thể gọi là trung hòa carbon. Cái mức này thì các nước quốc gia trên thế giới thì đều đang nghiên cứu để mà các nước nhất là các nước đang phát triển cũng đang cố gắng đạt được các cái mục tiêu về không và công bố cho toàn thế giới biết để mà có những cái hành động chung tay với các nước, và đặc biệt là lời kêu gọi của Liên Hợp Quốc và các quốc gia hiện nay. Thế thì hiện nay trên thế giới thì tôi biết được rằng là đã có 14 nước đã đưa vào luật là cái trung hòa carbon. Đấy, ví dụ như Hàn Quốc gần đây là đã đưa vào cái Quốc hội đã thông qua luật trung hòa carbon và phát triển các cái hình thức khác nhau, ví dụ thị trường carbon, thế rồi là trao đổi các cơ chế trao đổi tín chỉ bù trì carbon. Thế thì Việt Nam, tôi xin nói đến Việt Nam thì là quốc gia chịu tác động rất nặng nề của biến đổi khí hậu. Đấy, và cũng không còn nguy cơ xa vời nữa mà nó đang hiện hữu và nó tác động đến khắp các vùng miền, các cái địa phương và con người. Thế thì chúng tôi mà cũng nhận thức rằng là các cái vấn đề về triều cường, ngập lụt, hạn hán như ngài đại sứ Anh cũng đã có thời gian sống ở Việt Nam rất là lâu và đã chứng kiến, và ông cũng đã phát biểu vừa rồi. Thì hiện nay ấy, là những cái vấn đề kể cả về thích ứng và giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính thì được chính phủ Việt Nam rất là quan tâm. Đấy, thế thì coi ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu là có cái vấn đề mà có ý nghĩa sống còn và là trách nhiệm của cả hệ thống chính trị Việt Nam. Đấy, thế và phải đồng thời tôi cũng có những cái hành động, các cái kế hoạch chiến lược để mà thích ứng với biến đổi khí hậu và giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính, sử dụng hiệu quả bền vững các cái nguồn tài nguyên thiên nhiên. Đấy, thế thì năm 2020 chúng tôi đã rà soát cập nhật cái NDC chúng tôi đã gửi cho UNFCCC. Và với cái mức tăng kỳ vọng đóng góp cho giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính và gia tăng các cái hành động thích ứng với biến đổi khí hậu. Thế thì hiện nay chúng tôi đang được giao là xây dựng một chiến lược quốc gia về biến đổi khí hậu cho giai đoạn từ nay đến năm 2050. Mà theo yêu cầu của thỏa thuận Paris thì họ khuyến nghị các quốc gia phải xây dựng cái chiến lược phát thải thấp dài hạn. Thế thì chúng tôi cũng sẽ cập nhật và xây dựng cái chiến lược quốc gia biến đổi khí hậu đến 2050 với những cái mục tiêu kỳ vọng để mà giảm phát thải khí nhà kính cao hơn. Đấy, cao hơn so với NDC, và cũng cùng với các mục tiêu là chúng tôi sẽ có cái mục tiêu phát thải đỉnh và hướng đến cái trung hòa carbon. Đấy, thì cũng đây là những cái nỗ lực của Việt Nam đang triển khai thực hiện, và chúng tôi sẽ có những cái con số để mà chúng tôi đi COP26, COP26 ở Vương quốc Anh vào tháng 11 năm nay. Và để có căn cứ pháp lý thực hiện các biện pháp để mà đạt được cái mục tiêu phát thải khí nhà kính đặt ra, thì cũng xin thông báo với các quý vị rằng là Quốc hội của Việt Nam cũng đã thông qua luật bảo vệ môi trường năm 2020, tức là năm ngoái. Và hiện nay thì chúng tôi đang xây dựng các cái văn bản hướng dẫn, các cái nghị định và thông tư, thì trong đó là tập trung rất cao vào vấn đề về giảm phát thải, rồi vấn đề về kiểm kê khí nhà kính phải thay đổi, rồi là MAV, thế rồi là các cái vấn đề mà các cái doanh nghiệp phải thực hiện giảm phát thải, có kế hoạch, và chúng tôi sẽ thực hiện tất cả các cái doanh nghiệp Việt Nam mà có cái mức phát thải là ở một mức mà 3.000 tấn CO2 tương đương một năm, thì chúng tôi sẽ đưa vào cái danh mục mà sẽ phải cắt giảm, sẽ phải kiểm kê, và sau đó chúng tôi sẽ có lộ trình giảm phát thải khí nhà kính. Thế thì phải nói rằng là cái luật bảo vệ môi trường năm 2020 của chúng tôi là nội dung của nó đã bám sát tư tưởng là chuyển đổi từ cái mô hình nâu mà sang xanh, tức là tiếp cận một cái cách tiếp cận sinh thái và thân thiện với môi trường cao độ. Các cái tiêu chuẩn quy chuẩn của chúng tôi cũng tiếp cận với các cái tiêu chuẩn và quy chuẩn của các nước tiên tiến trên thế giới, và các cái vấn đề về ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu cũng đã đề cập vào luật này, và chúng tôi cũng cố gắng để mà rất nỗ lực để mà triển khai các cái nội dung chi tiết của cái luật bảo vệ môi trường này trong cái thời gian từ năm nay cho đến những cái năm tới, để chúng tôi sẽ có những cái từ chính sách dẫn đến các cái hành động. Đấy, thì ở Việt Nam cũng hôm nay cái chủ đề nó còn vấn đề về thị trường carbon. Thế thì Việt Nam cũng thấy rằng là cái định giá carbon pricing là cái vấn đề mà cũng có thể là có cái ý nghĩa trong cái vấn đề về giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính. Thế thì Việt Nam đã tham gia vào chương trình PMA, tức là cái chương trình đối tác thực hiện sẵn sàng tham gia thị trường carbon của World Bank cùng với các cái quốc gia trên thế giới. Thì hiện nay thì chúng tôi đã thực hiện từ năm 2015 cho đến năm 2020. Thế và trong hiện nay và chúng tôi đã sẵn sàng để tham gia vào cái sáng kiến về cái đối tác thực hiện thị trường carbon, tức là chương trình đối tác thực hiện thị trường carbon là PMI. Đấy, thì chúng tôi sẽ tiến hành mà cái chương trình này từ nay đến năm 2030. Thế và trong cái luật bảo vệ môi trường chúng tôi cũng đã quy định rõ một cái nội dung về việc tổ chức và phát triển thị trường carbon ở Việt Nam. Hiện nay chúng tôi cũng học tập rất nhiều nước về cái mô hình phát triển thị trường carbon. Đấy, thứ nhất là kể cả là Trung Quốc thì gần đây đã vận hành cái thị trường carbon từ tháng 2 năm 2021. Thì đây là một cái kinh nghiệm rất là quý đối với Việt Nam chúng tôi. Và phải nói rằng là đến nay thì có khoảng 100 quốc gia, trong đó có Việt Nam cũng đưa cái mục tiêu để mà áp dụng cái định giá carbon vào trong các cái hành động để thực hiện cái mục tiêu trong NDC. Đấy, thế thì cái vấn đề nỗ lực ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu và giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính hiện nay đối với Việt Nam ấy, thì cái nguồn lực của chính phủ nó còn hạn chế. Thế thì cái vai trò của khối doanh nghiệp tôi thấy nó rất là quan trọng và có ý nghĩa để góp phần cho cái vấn đề giảm phát thải. Đấy, thì hiện nay mà nếu các doanh nghiệp mà chúng ta không cắt giảm phát thải thì nhà nước thì cũng chỉ là dẫn dắt, là định hướng, là chính sách. Thế cho nên là chúng ta phải huy động tất cả các cái khối doanh nghiệp này và cộng đồng vào cuộc trong cái giai đoạn thực hiện thỏa thuận Paris hiện nay. Đấy, và chúng tôi ngoài cái việc mà chúng tôi thực hiện cái thị trường carbon trong tương lai, thì cái vấn đề mà trao đổi bù trừ tín chỉ carbon song phương đa phương là Việt Nam cũng tham gia rất mạnh mẽ. Đấy, điển hình chúng tôi có thể nói rằng là thứ nhất là cái ngày xưa trước đây là cái khuôn khổ cơ chế phát triển sạch tức là cái cơ chế phát triển sạch là CDM, thì Việt Nam cũng là cái nước thứ hai là thực hiện các cái dự án này. Thế và chúng tôi có được 257 dự án và cộng với là 13 cái chương trình hoạt động. Đấy, thì nó được xếp thứ 4 trên thế giới. Đấy, và đứng thứ hai ở các nước khu vực Đông Nam Á. Thế thì cái số lượng dự án CDM đăng ký là như vậy. Thế và cái tổng lượng phát thải khí nhà kính giảm nhẹ của 257 cái dự án CDM này đã vào khoảng là 140 triệu tấn CO2 tương đương trong cái kỳ tín dụng. Đấy, thế và chúng tôi cũng xin thông báo là từ năm 2013 cho đến nay thì chính phủ Việt Nam với chính phủ Nhật Bản cũng đã phối hợp triển khai cái cơ chế tín chỉ chung. Đấy, để thực hiện giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính và nâng cao cái hiệu suất năng lượng trong các cái dự án. Thế thì đây là cơ chế JCM với cái mục đích để mà hỗ trợ các cái doanh nghiệp thúc đẩy và chuyển giao các cái công nghệ phát thải thấp. Đấy, rồi là đến nay thì chúng tôi là có 14 cái dự án của các cái lĩnh vực chủ yếu là năng lượng đi vào hoạt động, mà tiềm năng giảm phát thải khí nhà kính thì cũng đạt là 16.000 tấn CO2 tương đương một năm. Và các doanh nghiệp đã tham gia các cái cơ chế khác. Đấy, cũng phải nói rằng là các cái cơ chế trao đổi bù trừ tín chỉ tự nguyện khác như là tiêu chuẩn vàng, tiêu chuẩn carbon được thẩm tra, hay là tiêu chuẩn chính chỉ năng lượng tái tạo, vân vân. Đó là các cái vấn đề mà những cái tiêu chuẩn mà các cái doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam cũng đã tiếp cận. Đấy, thế thì đối với tiêu chuẩn vàng thì Việt Nam có 20 dự án đăng ký và đã được cấp tín chỉ, và tổng lượng tín chỉ mà được phát hành thì nó là 3,3 triệu tín chỉ. Thế và theo tiêu chuẩn carbon mà được thẩm tra là có 17 dự án. Đấy, và số tín chỉ là hơn 600.000 tín chỉ. Và cái tiêu chuẩn chứng chỉ năng lượng tái tạo thì chúng tôi cũng có 4 dự án hiện nay mới ít, và có là gần 200.000 chứng chỉ đã được ban hành. Thế thì có thể thấy rằng là các cái doanh nghiệp Việt Nam ấy thì có cái tiềm năng và cái kinh nghiệm để thực hiện các cái hoạt động giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính mà theo các cái cơ chế tạo tín chỉ carbon cũng như là trao đổi tín chỉ carbon với các quốc gia khác. Thế thì để mà tiếp tục phát huy được cái vai trò của doanh nghiệp chủ động hơn, cũng như là tạo thêm các cơ chế sự khuyến khích tham gia của xã hội trong cái nỗ lực giảm phát thải khí nhà kính, thì Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường đang phối hợp với các bộ ngành để xây dựng một cái đề án phát triển thị trường carbon từ nay đến năm 2030. Thế thì theo lộ trình của cái việc phát triển thị trường carbon này thì chúng tôi dự kiến là sẽ thí điểm vào năm 2025. Đấy, và sẽ năm 2027, 2028 thì chúng tôi sẽ bước vào để vận hành cái thị trường carbon ở Việt Nam, và tiến tới là sẽ là tham gia vào thị trường carbon các nước trên thế giới. Thế thì để mà làm các cái việc này thì hiện nay là chúng tôi đang xây dựng hoàn thiện các cái hệ thống văn bản quy phạm pháp luật, rồi là các cái điều kiện hạ tầng để mà các cái quy chế, rồi là các cái công cụ khác để mà phát triển cái thị trường carbon trong tương lai. Thế thì các doanh nghiệp, nhà đầu tư sẽ được hỗ trợ tăng cường năng lực. Đấy, thế còn sẽ gọi là tăng cường năng lực và nhận thức để mà các doanh nghiệp sẵn sàng giao dịch thí điểm thị trường carbon từ năm 2025. Thế thì thông qua các cái kinh nghiệm và triển khai thực hiện thị trường carbon của các nước trên thế giới thì chúng tôi hy vọng rằng là Việt Nam chúng tôi sẽ sớm hoàn thiện các cái điều kiện cần thiết và sẽ tổ chức cái thị trường carbon trong nước và tiến tới tham gia thị trường carbon của các nước để góp phần thực hiện NDC của Việt Nam. Và chúng tôi cũng mong rằng để mà trong cái quá trình mà thực hiện các cái vấn đề giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính thì hiện nay là chính phủ cũng đang có cái lộ trình giảm cái năng lượng hóa thạch và phát triển gia tăng của các cái loại hình năng lượng tái tạo, rồi là các cái công nghệ mới để mà chúng tôi thực hiện cái lộ trình giảm phát thải khí nhà kính và theo cái yêu cầu của thỏa thuận Paris cũng như là cái mục tiêu của đất nước chúng tôi. Thế thì tôi mong rằng là các cái quốc gia, đặc biệt là các cái ngân hàng, các định chế tài chính cũng quan tâm và hỗ trợ cho các cái doanh nghiệp Việt Nam có thể tiếp cận và có được những cái nguồn lực vừa về công cụ và nguồn lực để các cái doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam sẵn sàng tham gia thực hiện các cái hành động giảm nhẹ phát thải rồi là tham gia thị trường carbon, rồi là trao đổi bù trừ tín chỉ đối với các nước khác, rồi các quốc gia. Thế rồi tại hội thảo hôm nay thì tôi thông qua các cái trao đổi của các quý vị ở hội thảo thì tôi cũng có thêm thông tin và những cái góc nhìn nó mang tính tổng quát, rồi định hướng các chính sách cho Việt Nam về ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu và phát triển thị trường carbon, và để từ đó thì sẽ có thể xây dựng các cái chiến lược sản xuất kinh doanh phù hợp hướng đến phát triển kinh tế carbon thấp và đóng góp cho cái nỗ lực phát thải khí nhà kính của Việt Nam, và cũng như là đóng góp vào nỗ lực giảm phát thải khí nhà kính quy mô toàn cầu. Thế thì và chúng tôi cũng sẽ có những cái kỳ vọng và có những cái lộ trình để thực hiện mạnh mẽ các cái vấn đề giảm phát thải ở Việt Nam chúng tôi. Và cuối cùng tôi cũng xin trân trọng cảm ơn ngân hàng Standard Chapter Việt Nam và BritCham đã tổ chức cái hội thảo này rất là có ý nghĩa, và trong bối cảnh Việt Nam đang triển khai những cái nhiều hoạt động mà từ chính sách cho đến thực tiễn về giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính và thực hiện NDC. Đặc biệt là hội thảo của chúng ta cũng đang diễn ra trước cái thời điểm mà cái hội nghị COP26 được tổ chức tại Glasgow ở Vương quốc Anh vào tháng 11 năm nay. Thế thì cái hội thảo của chúng ta rất có ý nghĩa, và tôi hy vọng rằng là chúng ta có thể có những cái hội thảo khác của Ngân hàng Anh và BritCham sẽ tổ chức để mà thu hút thêm cái mời các cái đại diện của doanh nghiệp Việt Nam tham gia trong thời gian tới, và các nhà quản lý đến cũng sẽ có những cái phổ biến các cái chính sách và thu hút những cái doanh nghiệp để mà tham gia cái ứng phó biến đổi khí hậu và giảm nhẹ phát thải khí nhà kính. Tôi rất kỳ vọng vào những cái điều này. Và cuối cùng xin chúc sức khỏe bà Tổng Giám đốc, ngài Đại sứ và tất cả các cái quý vị tham dự hội thảo hôm nay. Rồi xin chúc sức khỏe các đồng chí, và sẽ mong được cái hội thảo của chúng ta sẽ đóng góp được nhiều cho những cái thông tin, và hai nữa là cho cái khối doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam mà trong thời gian tới mà chúng tôi có thể tiếp cận tham gia được các cái hoạt động của Ngân hàng Anh, rồi các cái tổ chức và hỗ trợ khác đối với doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.
Thank you, Mr. Kung, for your insights and steer on Vietnam's ambitious development towards climate change and to grow the voluntary carbon markets in Vietnam. So this ends our keynote session. I will now hand over the stage to my co-host, Chairman of BritCham Vietnam Sustainability Working Group for the second part of our webinar. Over to you, Denzel.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you also to Mr. Kung and the Climate Change Department of Monroe for participating in this event, and to Ambassador Ward for his keynote speech. Thank you also to Standard Chartered. We're delighted to be able to co-host this sustainability webinar series with Standard Chartered. In the second part of this webinar, we will hear from three individuals who are leading both corporate and financial innovation with respect to sustainability. First of all, we'll hear from Chris Leeds. Chris is the Executive Director and Head of Carbon Markets at Standard Chartered Bank. In that role, he's leading the bank's carbon market strategy and brings extensive experience with respect to both structuring and trading commodities and emissions. He was recently elected to the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, and both in that role and his role at Standard Chartered, he's at the forefront of financial innovation when it comes to carbon trading. So we're very fortunate to have Chris. He's going to provide an overview of the principles which govern carbon markets, comment on some of the recent developments, and then how carbon markets play with corporate strategy and planning. So over to Chris, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Denzel, and thanks, Mr. Kung, as well, for his words earlier on. I'm very excited to hear about the developments within Vietnam on the NDC, on the nationally determined contribution, and also on his commitment to carbon markets, which I will talk to you a little bit about this morning. So, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I think what's always useful is to put things into context, and this is a very interesting slide which people find very helpful, and it just shows you what we've got to achieve in a very short period of time. Now, these are actually related to CO2. This doesn't include all greenhouse gas emissions, which actually would take it closer to 50 billion tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions. But of CO2, we've got 41 billion tons is the current level of emissions. We need to reduce that to by 23 gigatons, 23 billion tons by 2030. So that's less than 9 years away. And then to net zero by 2050. And the net zero is important because there is going to be a point at which we cannot reduce emissions any further, human related emissions from some of the industries that we're involved in, and agriculture and others, and therefore we have to actually remove emissions from the atmosphere. But this really does show you the scale of the challenge ahead of us, and that's quite an important number at the bottom, 570 gigatons. That's actually probably lower than that now. That is our carbon budget. That's the amount of CO2 that we've got left that we can emit globally before temperatures increase considerably above the 1.5 degree goal. And as you can imagine, if we continue to emit at 41 billion tons a year, at that rate, we'll run out very, very quickly, and we will cause severe and unreversible damage to the global atmosphere and environment. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be talking about this morning or this afternoon, your time, sorry, is around carbon pricing. And the idea of putting a price on emissions. And we heard earlier on about the targets for Vietnam, but also the targets globally. And yes, government action is going to be important. There will need to be legislation in place, but a carbon price enables people to be able to determine the price for those emissions. It ensures that the polluter pays, and that that the right incentives are put in place for companies and society to be able to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, as we see here, climate change is now a priority for large companies. We all understand that many companies around the world, both locally and globally, and we'll hear from some of those after me, really want to reduce their emissions considerably. Now, some are already facing what we call mandatory carbon markets, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but many are also trying to do what they believe is the right thing to do voluntarily. So this is where the voluntary carbon markets come in. Companies looking to measure and set targets, reduce their emissions, and then when they've done everything they possibly can within their own value chains, within their own organizations, then they will look at carbon credits to offset those remaining emissions or compensate. The word that we tend to use now is compensate for the residual emissions that they're unable to reduce on an annual basis. And this helps to get money into projects that wouldn't see it otherwise. And we're talking largely agricultural and nature-based projects, so forestry, agroforestry, those types of projects that we see particularly prevalent in Southeast Asia. But also we're looking at getting money into new technologies. So it might be sustainable aircraft fuels, it might be hydrogen, green hydrogen, it might be direct air capture of carbon, or then long-term storage. These types of technologies that we really need to see grow to be able to decarbonize the economy, to be able to decarbonize energy production, to be able to decarbonize transportation, and to decarbonize the industrial sector, such as cement and steel, which are large emitters of CO2. So these are the areas that we really want to see grow, and we think that this has to, if the commitments that have been made globally, we could see the voluntary carbon market increase 15-fold by 2030. This year, we expect to see around 200 million tons of carbon credits traded, but by 2030, we could see a 15-fold increase in that through different schemes around the world. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are two types of markets. We have a compliance market and versus a voluntary market. They are complementary, but they also have a lot of interaction between each other. So when we talk about compliance markets, until recently, the largest compliance market in the world was the EU ETS. It covered nearly 2 billion tons of carbon emissions. It was up to 55% of the European emissions, and it's certainly still the most liquidly traded. It's the most actively traded market. Today, the price of carbon emissions in Europe is 65 euros a ton. Now, not long ago, they were only trading at 5 euros. That's gone up considerably because of some changes that the Europeans have made, and they are focusing on reducing their carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. Now, they've from 1990 levels. They've managed to do it 21%, so you can see there's an awful long way to go. Recently, the Chinese have set up their own mandatory market. It covers around 3 billion tons, so now makes it the largest mandatory market in the world. But it's still fairly small in terms of the amount that it's trading, and it only covers the power sector. It doesn't cover any other sectors. We think that will change, and we think that will grow considerably. It will be one of the main policy tools for the Chinese to meet their own commitments. But even the Chinese are allowing some use of voluntary carbon credits within their own system. And this is where we see the interaction between voluntary and mandatory. So countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, some of the US states allow companies to be able to use carbon credits for their own to meet the targets that they have under the mandatory schemes, and this creates that connection between them. So this is the importance of markets, and it creates, as I said earlier, this price for carbon emissions. In Europe, the price is at 65 euros a ton. That is making a huge difference in terms of creating a price at which people will then reduce their own carbon emissions. It mainly affects the power sector, so it is driving down, it has reduced the amount of coal production in Europe considerably over the last 20 years. In the UK now, our coal-fired production is very low indeed, and in fact, by the end of 2025, coal-fired power stations will be completely shut down. All coal-fired power stations will be completely shut down in the UK. We'll be relying on gas, but increasingly on renewables and storage, long-term storage. So this has been helped by a carbon price, and we are seeing this happening around the world. A voluntary carbon price can change behavior internally. What it does is it allows companies to set an internal carbon price, and then it produces an incentive for their employees and their operations to reduce their carbon emissions, be that through energy consumption, through the use of various materials. It could be through transportation, all sorts of areas. So it's a really important part of the carbon market. Next slide, please. A very short slide, I think, on just what a carbon credit is and how it's used. There are some very important concepts that we look at when we're talking about carbon credits, and these are credits that are generated by projects within voluntary markets to reduce carbon emissions. And it's absolutely imperative that they meet certain criteria, and these criteria are the most important being that they are additional. They have to be additional to what would have happened otherwise. And Mr. Chung talked about the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. These are the same types of criteria that we look at when we're looking at the Clean Development Mechanism and credits that are produced under that. So additionality is incredibly important. They have to be over and above what would normally happen. Then the other 4 criteria are also incredibly important. They have to be real, they have to be enforceable, measurable and verifiable, and then permanent. These are the really important areas that we like to look at when looking at a carbon credit. There tend to be 2 types. Avoided or reduced emissions. Avoided emissions could be related to avoided deforestation. It could be energy efficiency, biomass, these types of credits, renewable energy, and then removal emissions. Typically, removals at the moment come from forestry, planting trees, changing the way that agriculture is managed, but increasingly we're going to be looking at technological removals. You may have seen that there was a plant that started up production in Iceland recently that actually has a technique for direct air capture. It is pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it permanently. And we will see more of this as time goes by. Next slide, please. So, as Denzel mentioned earlier on, I am part of the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets. This was set up last year, initiated by Mark Carney, and Bill Winters, Standard Chartered Group CEO, is the chair, and I've been supporting him in the development of this this initiative. And what we are trying to do is to ensure that the carbon credits that are generated around the world globally, whether it's in Vietnam, China, India, or for that matter, America and Europe, have a consistent quality and a very high quality. It's about creating high integrity carbon credits that are then fungible, in other words, that can be traded from one country to another, and that are of very high quality. And this needs to be traded in a robust and transparent and liquid market. And so I'm also working with various initiatives around the world, and most notably the Climate Impact X initiative in Singapore to develop carbon markets around the world. And we're looking to work with partners to develop these markets as quickly as possible to be able to generate these high quality carbon credits that really help to reduce emissions as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But it is so important that companies reduce their own emissions first and then look to buy carbon credits to compensate for those residual emissions that are unable to reduce immediately. So that's a really important initiative that we are involved in, and as I said, we'd like to speak to others within the Vietnamese economy about how they can participate and cooperate with us. So we'd be really interested to hear from anybody around that. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I think just to finish up, what I wanted to do was to focus on what companies are doing around the world related to voluntary carbon markets, and obviously how this can relate to the Vietnamese economy. One thing that we are very keen to see happen in November in Glasgow at the COP conference is that the Article 6 rules are agreed. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I don't want to get into too many technicalities, but it is an important piece of the Paris Agreement that will facilitate international trading of carbon credits. And this may be under the mandatory markets that we've heard about. It will allow transfer of carbon credits between countries, but also under the voluntary markets. And one of the things that they are looking to develop is a sustainable development mechanism. This will replace the clean development mechanism and will allow the transfer of carbon credits between companies and between countries. in an effective manner. And this is exactly what companies are looking for around the world. And we see a lot of initiatives by large multinationals to commit to net zero, and then to use carbon credits in an effective way, either to provide that internal carbon pricing, but also to provide cash and funding to projects that would not receive it otherwise. And then there's a lot of developments with intermediaries who are trying to set prices to create that global marketplace for carbon credits. And we're involved in a lot of these initiatives. And then finally, we look at the number of suppliers who are trying to develop carbon credits around the world. Now, some of these are actually coming from the emitters themselves, some of the large emitters, and I think we may hear something about that shortly on some of the activities of companies who are emitters and who are also trying to change their business models to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. But then many of the projects are developed by smaller companies around the world, and I think we would see many of those within Vietnam who can develop projects internally, and they will be able to use those carbon credits potentially within Vietnamese mandatory markets, but also within the global voluntary markets. So we're keen to really promote that activity. And again, Standard Chartered stands ready to support companies within Vietnam on their decarbonisation goals. So with that, I'll pass back to Denzel and look forward to participating in the plenary session shortly.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Ms. Gwen Thị-Bích-Vân, who is the chairwoman of Unilever in Vietnam. As the chairwoman of Unilever, Ms. Vân heads one of Vietnam's leading multinational companies and represents a company within which sustainability is a key priority. Unilever's own Climate Transaction Action Plan is a clear commitment to sustainability, with a roadmap to reduce emissions within Unilever's own operations to zero by 2030 and to net zero across its value chain by 2039. So Ms. Vân, if I could please invite you for your presentation.
Thank you, Denzel, for the introduction. And thanks again for having me at the sustainability webinar today to share about Unilever's commitments and actions towards net zero carbon emission to contribute to addressing the climate challenge. I would need help from our organizer to move the slides, so excuse me, I have to hint to them by saying next one. Okay? So next one, please. So look, we've been very pioneering, backward please. Okay. So we've been very pioneering in sustainability agendas and have put the focus on sustainability as our core purpose in our strategies and action in order to keep ourselves on the right tracks of delivering social commitment. We launch and consistently pursue a sustainability agenda around three main themes, and I highlight those on the screens about improving the health of the planet, to improve people's health, confidence, and well-being. And the third one is to contribute to a fairer and more socially inclusive world. As you know, we pay much attention to climate actions as a major theme, as a climate crisis has for too long been misunderstood as a future environmental issue. However, the fact is that today it is a socio-economic crisis impacting life and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. You know, getting close to Vietnam, we've seen poor habits and lacking of clean waters, or even life-threatening extreme weather events like floods, drought, landslide, visible impacts caused by climate change. Next one, please. You know, at Unilever, we put in place a climate transition action plans, which sets out a range of targets and actions that designed to deliver an emission reduction pathway and in racing to net zero. As you see, in short terms, our emission reduction targets is to reduce, in absolute terms, our operational emission by 70% by 2025 against 2015 baselines. Here I'm referring to Scope 1 and 2. And then in medium terms, from there, from a short-term plan, we will reach up to 100% by 2030. And in the longer terms, there's a net zero value chain targets to achieve net zero emission covering, Scope 1, 2, 3 emission by 2039. Next one, please. To get there, our approach covers activities within our operation, our value chain, our brands, as well as our work to influence wider society. Achieving our net zero by 2039 target it requires a wide range of action. From our own operation, this is a small share of our value chain emission, but it represents those over which we have a complete direct control. And along the value chain, we have opportunity to reduce emission from our current product portfolio through targeted intervention, both upstream and downstream. For example, by encouraging and inviting our suppliers to set science-based targets, and then we will later expand into logistics to work with partners to shift the lower to the low emission transport option. Besides, great opportunities will come from strategic integration into our brands. We love innovation, and now our innovation program with very clear objective and direction. It will be the redesign of our products in ways that reduce emission. This can be through concentrating or more compacting our products, or developing new lower emission ingredient substitutes, which can have significant impacts on our ability to reduce value chain emission. However, with the share of our value chain emission falling outside of our direct control, and those are still not good enough. So societal change remains very critical to achieving our target. So therefore, influencing wider society is an integral part of our plans. So you see the whole plans here is held together by a commitment to transparent governance and reporting, go up to our group levels, and increasingly by engaging with consumers. For a longer run, our ambition is to communicate the carbon footprint of every product we sell in the futures. Next one, please. For the to-do list, in fact, today in Unilever's worldwide, we're launching a world to-do list campaigns. So we have a to-do list identified across the scope for the entire value chain, specifically in Vietnam. With the time we're having today, I'd like to share with you 3 key highlights. And those are emotion, with great progress so far. The very first one, I'll be talking about plastic initiative through circular economy in plastic waste management. And then the second one, I will talk about recycle and renewable carbon in formulation via a clean future campaign. And then last but not least, I will talk about the nature-based solution with renewable resources and tree plantation actions. And we certainly make sure these actions are attaching with clear target to accomplish. Next one, please. About plastic waste management, as you know, almost all plastic is derived from materials and substances made from fossil fuels. So the process of extracting and transporting those fuels, then manufacturing plastic creates billions and billions of tons of greenhouse gases. So besides, it's estimated that Vietnam specifically discharged more than 1.8 million tons plastic waste, and only 27% of which is recycled. So this is based on a report from Monraes in 2019. So therefore, circular economy in plastic, the models we initiated, this is to help address the plastic relevant issues to contribute to net zero commitments. The model we having got 4 pillars, talking about technology, innovation, application, and then communication, education to raise people awareness and action. And then about plastic waste segregation and collection, and lastly about policy building. And I have to say that the pillar plastic waste segregation collection is a fundamental step to help bring plastic back to the economy for recycling and reuse, which helps cut down the significant amounts of carbon emission from plastic production process. We made great progress. Today, we already have 55% virgin plastic reduction and over 60% recyclable and 100% our bottle products trading in Vietnam already applied PCR in this year. So it's, I have to say, it's a huge engagement from partners to help us to run the models, especially to educate consumers to segregate as source, and to work with partners to collect thousands of tons of plastic in post-use and put it back to the system. Next one. About clean future, this is really a very exciting one. We initiate and leverage the recycle and renewable carbons in population via clean future campaigns in order to raise to net zero as the ambition. About product formats, being concentration and compactions is one of the routes, and we can further reduce emissions from product formulation by transitioning away from fossil fuels as feedstocks for our chemicals. So in September last year, Unilever globally, we announced the ambition to replace 100% of carbon derived from fossil fuels in our home care population with renewable or recycled carbons by 2030. And through this Clean Future campaigns, we are reinventing the chemistry for our home care products. Notably, there's a few highlights I'd like to share. Idea is we want to explore and use the bioscience in industrial biotechnology to produce highly efficient cleaning ingredients from sustainably sourced biomass, or a new bio cotton system. We're using in our hand wash, dishwash, sunlight today, or a new high-performing enzyme system for the entire home care portfolio. Something to share with you, in Vietnam, 96% of our home care products is already biodegradable. And while we are aiming and reaching to finish, the milestone, which is to cross 100% by 2030. We want to turn the carbon dioxide from industrial emission into useful chemical and minerals through carbon captures and utilization. So adopting this approach, it could help us to deliver up to 28% greenhouse gas saving in the product formulation, which will delivering new consumer benefits, such as mildness to skin, which is very nice in general. We are now exploring and to extend and scale this idea up for the rest of our home care portfolio. Next one. About nature-based solution, I think it will come from renewable electricity and renewable fuels and tree plantation, as you heard from Chris. The world cannot wait until 2039 to begin the world of investing in nature and protecting tropical forests that once gone will be lost forever. In fact, research shows that natural climate solution could provide up to 37% of emission reduction that the world needs by 2030 to stay on track for the Paris Agreement's goals. Therefore, planting trees to expand the forest areas is a key initiative in our action plans as well in the Race to Net Zero commitment. 1 million trees is our commitment to be planted by 2025. And this hope that it can contribute to the government objective of 1 billion trees to be planted in the period of 2021-2025 to tackle climate issues in Vietnam. Next one, please. Today I have an excellent news to be proud to share with you that we now have 100% renewable electricity across 5 continents. This is across all factories, offices, R&D facilities, data centers, warehouses and distribution centers across Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and North America are now powered by 100% renewable grade electricity. And of course, my chief supply chain, Mark Engels, he said, of course, there is more work to be done, but we hope that this inspires further action elsewhere and help prove that it is possible to combat the climate crisis and to hold the global warming 1.5 Celsius degree. So he said, renewable is doable. Next one. So I think I come to the end of my sharing today. Yes, we have bold vision about carbon net zero emission, and that is hugely exciting. So we highly appreciate the effort from governments of Vietnam to proactively address climate crisis by carrying out several policy actions that we listened to Mr. Kung earlier. And also that President Winston, who stated at high-level open debates as United Nations Security Control in climate security last week. And he said Vietnam is determined and strongly committed to take climate action and develop a green, sustainable, and low-carbon economy. So this would definitely gives us high confidence that the government is committed to set an ambitious target on climate action. And we therefore believe that the government is going to develop and implement decarbonization strategy policy framework. So it will help Unilever Vietnam and Think Alike businesses, like many of you sitting in the audience today, to have the confidence to invest more in a net zero future. So last but not least, this is not the business alone. This is not the government's policy alone, but this is truly a joint effort made by government, public-private organization, international organization association, even civil individuals to contribute to a big picture, from strategy, policy, but we need to have a firm commitment and specific action to actualize the net zero carbon emission vision, which have solved the climate crisis and save our planet for the current and the future generations. And thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Denzel.
Ms. Van, thank you very much. And I think that's a really interesting example of really innovative strategy that other companies in Vietnam will be able to follow, and lots of different points to pick up on the panel discussion. Our next speaker is Karen Wesley. Karen is a Vice President for Carbon and the Environment within Shell's Global Solutions team. Within that role, Karen is responsible for Shell's carbon and environmental performance globally and across their businesses. Karen is also representative for Shell on the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She's a senior leader in ESG and corporate sustainability in the energy sector. And today she'll share details of Shell's net zero strategy and environmental program. Thank you, Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Denzel, and thanks to the previous speakers. Excellent material, and it does save me time because I can focus just on the elements related to the energy sector. There was a slide before this that talked about a cautionary note that is essentially that you shouldn't buy stocks or make trading decisions based on what I'm going to say today. This is a disclosure that we always include in any presentation. And what I will talk to you today is our Powering Progress strategy that includes 4 elements. The focus will surely be on the achieving net zero emissions, but I don't want to leave aside respecting nature because of, as we heard from our previous presenter and the presenter before that about carbon trading and carbon markets, investment in nature is a key element for achieving net zero emissions and reducing the impacts on the environment and on people. So that will be the focus of my talk. We do also, of course, in our strategy have generating shareholder value as well as powering lives, but those 2 elements I won't cover as much today. The next slide highlights the features of our net zero emissions agenda, and it's actually been very well explained. If we can move to the next slide, the focus on scope 1, 2, and 3. Does someone have their finger on the button of slide 2? Right, and the next one from this. Great, thanks so much. And I think Chris did an amazing job explaining scope 1, 2, and 3, the different types of emissions and where they come from. In the case of Shell, you'll see that little pie chart there. About between 10 and 12% of our emissions come from our own production. So the producing of the fossil fuels that we still carry in our portfolio. But about 90% come from what we call scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions from the use of the energy sold, our own production, as well as the life cycle emissions from the energy we trade. So we also trade other people's energy. This isn't just related to Shell's energy production. And our ambition is to get to net zero across all of those scopes. And then you see the scale that we're talking about in relation to the scale that Chris highlighted on his presentation about the gigatons that need to be reduced in order to reach the net zero by 2050. In our case, it's 1.7 gigatons per year that we need to reduce. We did peak in 2018, and we'll be bringing down, year on year to that net zero ambition. We also peaked our oil and gas production in 2019 and have committed to no new what's called frontier exploration after 2025. So that's capturing the reductions in our own portfolio, which I'll get to in a moment as well in more detail. In terms of that ambition, we have set some interim goals and targets between now and 2050. So by 2030 to reduce by 20% and 2035 by 45%. However, we have had a Dutch court ruling asking us to accelerate this transition. So whereas our strategy will stay the same, we will certainly look to advance and accelerate those reductions across our portfolio and the scope 3 from our energy. So the next slide talks a bit more about the ways that we do that. And I think it's been very nicely summarized by other speakers that, the first thing to do is to reduce your own emissions from your own operations. That's called carbon abatement. That can be done through technology, things like energy efficiency, also divestment, of course, and shifting over to a lower carbon power business, investing in low carbon fuels, biofuels and hydrogen, and also shifting from coal to natural gas. So we heard from the gentleman that Vietnam has quite a significant coal production. Most Asian countries do have significant coal in their energy mix. So natural gas is a bridge from coal to the renewable energies. We also focus quite a bit, and I think Chris pointed this out, that there is already too much carbon in the atmosphere. Essentially, we can't continue to produce the same amount of CO2 and get to net zero and not remove carbon. So we have significant investment in both technology to reduce carbon emissions, which is called carbon capture and storage, which essentially means capturing emissions either from an industrial site or from direct air capture, and then sequestering it deep underground, or transporting it to offshore, for example, depleted gas fields. That's a very large scale way of reducing carbon. I think you can reduce several million tons a year. Places like Norway are already doing that. And then we have the natural sinks, also extremely important. And this is the nature-based solutions, or also called natural climate solutions. We're investing in reforestation, preventing deforestation, and other methods are used to essentially bring nature to the solution space in capturing the CO2, which is what nature's been doing since the the beginning of time. And that's why we have the atmosphere we have today, actually, because plants have been doing that for us and allowing us to breathe the air we breathe. So that's a very, very key area of investment. We do invest $100 million a year in our own origination of nature-based solutions, but we also trade significant amount of offsets. And as Chris highlighted, there's both voluntary and compliance offsets. One of the really important features here is we only use offsets for our Scope 3 emissions. We do not use any offsets for the Scope 1 emissions or our Scope 2 emissions. And we also use the mitigation hierarchy that's been described, i.e., avoid, reduce, abate before you even get to the point of compensating or offsetting for the greenhouse gas emissions related to our supply chain. So we'll get into that a bit more. The next slide really just highlights the role of collaboration. And I was very keen to hear from Unilever that they purchase renewable power, right? So this is another example of how working across sectors, across supply chains is so important, that all actors in supply chains are driving towards those net zero strategies, so that even those who are purchasing energy or those who are using energy for their IT systems, that was described also by the ambassador, all of those elements of the supply chain are stretching towards their own sectoral ambition. International coordination, national policy intervention, and these types of trading schemes that can allow the fungible carbon molecule to be traded globally are really important to allowing that to happen at scale. And that will be one of the key features of the Article 6 negotiations in Glasgow. The next slide gives us a little bit of a highlight, the next series of slides, but I'll just go to the next one. Focuses more on the respecting nature aspect. And I really bring this in because it's clear that there's a twin crisis going on. There's a twin crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss and nature loss that has a direct impact on lives, livelihoods, and the sustainable futures of many populations around the world. Many people who did the least to change the climate have the most severe impacts. So the investment in natural ecosystems that support people's livelihoods is absolutely important, and the opportunity for international businesses, international markets, and the financial sector to invest in nature to protect those communities who are impacted by climate change and to create more resilience around our coastal assets, etc., is really important. So these things to me very much go hand in hand. And by investing in nature, we're looking to increase biodiversity representation, as well as the water we've talked about in circular economy. We also have quite a few commitments around waste and plastics. So we have included environment in our strategy as well as net zero emissions, and therefore we try to take a holistic approach, knowing that there can be trade-offs between carbon reduction and investment in nature. And it's important to keep aware of that. For example, the chemical sector, the sector that Unilever was talking about, there are the circularity versus carbon. These are things that we need to make visible and address as choices and key choices in society. The next slide talks a bit about some of the commitments we've made, and I'll just highlight the biodiversity commitment, which is that any projects in areas rich in biodiversity, which we call critical habitats, will have a net positive impact on that habitat. We have some very good examples of this from Gabon, Russia, Sakhalin, and in Ireland, where we had projects where we did achieve net positive impact measured at the habitat level. We also have in our nature-based solutions, as I mentioned, where we invest for carbon sequestration, we also invest for biodiversity and commit to have a net positive impact on biodiversity. That is implemented in collaboration with other partners, such as the Nature Conservancy, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and local community actors who have a real vested interest in making sure that they preserve their natural ecosystems. We also have existing commitments around World Heritage Sites, etc. But this is an example in Australia where we have actually purchased a 10,000 hectare area to re-establish a diverse biodiversity system around an open woodland. So this was an area that was degraded, had fallen to quite poor ecological functioning, and has now been brought back with a mixture of native species and good biodiversity representation from fauna and flora. That's an interesting one because actually in some countries like Australia, offsets for biodiversity are also part of the compliance regime. So this is part of the conversation about what's compliance versus voluntary. There are some countries that are now looking at biodiversity as one of the areas where they try to create an offset type of regime. The next slide briefly talks about the circular economy piece. And here, very much related to the presentation, the previous presentation, we have actually begun to use biofeedstock and recycled plastic as feedstock in our chemicals production. So we have a commitment to use 1 million tons of recycled feedstock in chemicals. And we have already started through some investments. We've invested in a French company called Blue Alps, which uses pyrolysis to turn plastic waste into a liquid feedstock for chemicals. We've also just announced a very significant investment in the Pernis in the Netherlands, which is a large biofuels, which will be using waste materials, mostly waste oils, to produce fuel grade biofuels. That will also be linked to our sustainable aviation fuel goals, which are in line with the aviation sector. That's one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors as we know it today. So I think I'll leave it at that, given the time. Just wanted to present maybe a wider range of aspects related to our strategy. Clearly, carbon net zero is a very key feature, but not to forget the importance of investing in biodiversity, nature, and the circular economy elements. And you'll see probably over the years in Shell, more and more announcements coming through with investments, not only in renewable energies, but in these various aspects of technical solutions to some of these large, significant and scale problems. Just in terms of Asia, in terms of investment in Asia, there are, we think, significant opportunities in wind. There's strong wind speeds, there's high populations across coastlines, large customer demand. And we have indeed announced a partnership in South Korea for a 1.4 floating offshore wind, 1.4 gigawatts floating offshore wind project, and probably looking at other opportunities like that. And we are also investing significantly in solar through Singapore. And as I mentioned, this investment in plastics feedstock recycling, which will also be looking at Asian markets, particularly around our Bridgeham and Jurong facilities in Singapore. So I think I'll leave it at that. And thank you all very much for the attention and the excellent presentations preceding this one. This is the final point, that all of these things need to be done. There's no optionality anymore. Every effort needs to be made, and collaboration is going to be key to driving these changes at the scale that we need to mitigate those twin crises that I described of climate and biodiversity. Over to you, Denzel. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We're quite short on time, so maybe we can. I'll just focus the questions for the panel discussion, maybe initially around the proposals in Vietnam for a cap and trade and carbon offset market, and how we can draw on experiences from the US and Europe, and then also maybe just have a brief look at emission trading schemes in Asia as well. Chris, could I start with you, just in terms of your involvement in US and European markets, whether you have any initial observations or comments with respect to proposals in Vietnam, and then also with respect to how there might be scope for any form of bilateral cooperation between initiatives in the UK and Vietnam and their proposals here.
Yeah, thanks, Denzel. So I mean, I think the most important points that I've seen coming from the European market in particular, and it's the same actually when you look at most of the compliance markets that have been developed, is around measurement and reporting. So one of the things that you see when carbon markets are put in place is the requirement to measure and report, and that fact alone has a huge impact in terms of knowing what the problem is and knowing how to fix it, by actually having those measurements there and the expectation to report that to some central agency. So that's one of the first things the Chinese are doing at the moment, is actually going through that process of collating data and ensuring that people are making those reports. And then once you actually start to put in place your carbon scheme, it's around the allocation. How do you allocate that scarce resource, those emissions allowances that you're going to put into the market. There's two ways you can do that. You can auction them, you can sell them off, or you can give them away for free. If you sell them off, obviously it's like a tax. It's a requirement to purchase those, and it's a transfer of wealth from a company to the state, and the state then needs to decide how it's going to use those funds. Should they be reallocated in some way? If, on the other hand, they're given away for free, you're effectively subsidizing those industries that are receiving those free allowances. So that's very, very important. While from an economic perspective, it doesn't change the outcome, it does change behavior. And giving away free allowances reduces the incentives on companies to reduce their own emissions. So you have to look at it carefully. But one of the things that we saw in Europe was those industries that are affected by global competition, steel, cement, and large industrial organizations, fought very hard to ensure they do receive free allowances. They're now moving to a system of selling those allowances, but that coincides with an introduction of some kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism, so that there isn't unfair advantage taken between industries. So I think those are really important. The baseline is important. That issue related to leakage that is being dealt with by carbon border adjustment mechanisms is important, and then making sure that if you're going to link to other schemes, as we see within Europe. We see Europe linking into Switzerland, Norway, and a few others, and talking about linking to China. Then you have to have compatibility. You have to have clear goals that are compatible around those emissions reductions that are being made. And I think this is one of the sticking points between China and Europe, is that the Chinese scheme is still not there's not an absolute cap. It's intensity based. So they're looking for companies to reduce the intensity of their emissions, and not the overall cap. So that's the main things to look at.
Thanks, Chris. And we had many more questions, both from the chat and also for the panelists. But I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I think we may have to pick up these issues on another session. But if I can just thank the panelists and for the contributions today, and hand over to Michelle.
Yes, we need another half an hour, I think, but it's great conversations. Thank you so much, panel. Thank you, audience, for staying with us right to the very end. As we mentioned, we'll have a series of these, and we look forward to having everyone else, all of you back here for our next sessions. Well, thank you. I think I'm Michelle. You can now all disconnect. Bye.
Thank you.